a rock sits on our communion table this morning because a rock marks the spot where the story of this great nation of ours began. The rock in Plymouth, of course, is larger than our rock, but it is nowhere near as large as the pictures in our history books suggest. Plymouth Rock is a victim of hype. I grew up imagining that it was like the Rock of Gibraltar, big enough for all of our pilgrim forebears to cluster together on top of it with their heads bowed in prayer. I was just a bit disappointed to discover that it was a boulder located in a rather random spot along the bay. Still, big rocks fascinate me, especially ones that seem to be misplaced. I have a memory that goes as deep as anything that I can remember in my childhood. Across the street from my house was a very large boulder. It was like nothing else in my small world, and it made me wonder how it came to be marooned in that place. I came to the conclusion that boulders must grow from stones. I tested my theory by planting stones in my mother's flower box, fully expecting that eventually they would become boulders, the way that a potato grows from its tiny eyes. I was sure that was how the world worked. I was sure, even though my mother explained that stones don't grow into boulders. Stones stay stones, boulders stay boulders. They never change by themselves, never, ever. Still, I was not convinced. When nobody was looking, I'd go in the flower box and I'd check on the stones. I'd poke around that big boulder, looking to prove my mother wrong, doubting anything could possibly be big enough or strong enough to plunk that enormous piece of rock down in such a random spot across the street from my house. My alternative seemed much more reasonable. The rock must have started small and gotten bigger. I concluded it just must take a long, long time to grow a boulder. As theories go, my conclusion turned out to be bad geology, but good theology. Though we may seem as naive as a little kid who thinks that it's possible to grow a boulder from a stone, we gather here because we are in this work for the long haul. We are convinced that love is stronger than hate. We trust that there is a power at work in the world that is strong enough to bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice. It just takes a long, long time. We hear this conviction in the reading that Diana shared from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah reminded anybody who stopped to listen to him that God isn't giving up on this world until justice and peace are real for everybody. There will come a time when no one will build and another inhabit that building. No one will plant and another eat that fruit. There will come a time when we will not labor in vain or bear children for calamity. Yet, recent events in Natick and across the nation make the vision of Isaiah sound like so much wishful thinking or whistling in the dark to keep our spirits up. Frankly, it feels more realistic to grow a boulder from a stone. That is why it is important at times like this to listen to the rocks. They remind us just how narrow our definition of realistic might be. Because, 50,000 years ago or so, we can check with Sarah Hannah for the right geological time, but a long time ago, suffice it to say, if there had been a window through which we could have looked out at the world, all that we would have seen around us in this place would have been ice. Glaciers, at least a mile deep, advanced and retreated dozens of times over this ground, scouring and gouging and rearranging the landscape like giant bulldozers. They left behind large boulders like the one that fascinated me and like our celebrated Plymouth Rock. It is impressive to stand in front of one of these boulders and imagine the enormous power of ice that could carry something so big so far. Life feels like that sometimes. Life feels like being just ahead of an impending glacier moving toward us. Irresistible forces bear down on us, pulverizing our plans, grinding down our resolve, pushing out of reach all those things that really matter to us. Yet it is not true that glaciers take down everything in their path. And if the power of a glacier a mile deep can be resisted, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we can resist when it feels that life has slipped out of our control. If you need some firsthand evidence right now, check out the rocks. All you have to do, and this is the perfect weekend for it because there's a little bit of vacation time, all you have to do is hike through the Broadmoor Sanctuary or up to the water tower in the town forest off of Bacon Street. You will find teardrop-shaped hills that look like inverted spoons set on a table. They seem curiously out of place in the surrounding terrain. Those little hills are called drumlins. I always assumed that drumlins were outcroppings from the solid bedrock below, but it turns out that drumlins were formed from a conglomeration of stone and gravel and rock and sand and silt and everything else that had been scoured up and carried by the action of the glaciers as they advanced and retreated over thousands of years. And here is the important thing to recognize right now. Geologists believe that some of these drumlins formed not because the glaciers hid an unyielding chunk of exposed bedrock, but because something seemingly insignificant in that conglomeration of rocks and gravel and sand beneath the ice resisted the momentum of the glacier, like the first grain of sand that begins a dune, or the first snowflake that gathers into a drift. Something in that primordial ooze under the ice stopped. It resisted the forward momentum of the ice, and when it did, the glacier released a little bit of its burden. And that little bit of rock stayed put, and it grew into a wedge. And each time the glacier advanced and retreated, the ice bore down on it, and the drumlin accreted more and more material out of the primal ooze until it grew into a hill. That, though, is not all. It's not even the best. The best is this. As that wedge beneath the glacier grew, it began to deform the underside of the ice that was bearing down on it, that mile-thick ice. The pressure of the ice caused cracks, not in the rocks, but in the glacier itself. Those cracks in the ice, in turn, allowed more material to accumulate instead of eroding the point of resistance, instead of pushing aside all that accumulated rock and gravel. The force of the ice bearing down on the drumlin began to compress it, compress the silt and the gravel and the rocks together like clay, creating more and more resistance beneath the ice to that forward momentum of the glacier. So, it turns out that my preschool brain may have been onto something. You can, in fact, grow a stone. It just happens differently than you might expect, and it takes longer than you might hope. A drumlin grows because something under the ice stops. The size and significance of that something under the ice, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that the drumlin holds its ground. The force of the ice bearing down on it doesn't crush it. Instead, the pressure of the ice consolidates it and makes it more and more immovable until it cracks the glacier above it. Now that, my friends, is a pretty powerful metaphor for our current situation. We've got to think long term, because the vision and values of this congregation were not swept away a week and a half ago by forces beyond our control. We are just more aware right now of the pressure bearing down on us, and that might be a very good thing. I don't dispute that the moral arc of the universe seems further from justice than it did just a few weeks ago, but I believe in the power of resistance that formed the drumlins can also form our future. Our forebears in this church started piling up stones on this spot in 1799, and we aren't moving. We're in this for the long haul. We believe in the foundational vision that called John Eliot to reach out beyond race and language and custom to express the love and welcome of Christ. We've made mistakes along the way, sometimes big mistakes, but we remain committed to the vision proclaimed in our reading today by the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah did not speak those words when times were good. He did not call people to claim that powerful vision when everything was easy. He was standing in the rubble of his homeland where no stone had been left unturned. He looked around at all that had been lost, and he saw beyond the loss to that power at work in this world that is strong enough to bend the arc of the universe toward justice. We read those ancient words from the prophet today because we believe that God's intention for this world has not changed. So we aren't moving. We aren't moving off of our commitment to create a society where no one is homeless, where trans people don't have to be afraid to use the bathroom, and where same-gender loving people can marry their life partner. We aren't budging off our commitment to protect the environment or to change laws that have created in this country an epidemic of gun violence. We are committed to preserving the kind of town where our Muslim neighbors feel safe practicing their faith, and Asian and Latino students in our schools aren't faced with threats of deportation. We are committed to understand and confront the subtle racism that people of color experience in this country every day. We want those who work hard to receive a fair wage so that they can provide a good life for their families. We want our daughters to look in the mirror and know that they are amazing and that no one has a right to demean, diminish, or determine their choices. It does not matter who the president is, who runs Congress, or even who sits on the Supreme Court. Those forces that seem to overwhelm us will not change who we are. They will not change what we do. This is what we will do. We will stand up for what we believe in, we will stand up for one another, and we will stand together. Ice a mile thick, cracked, because of the resistance of that little drumlin growing beneath it. Ice that seems so unstoppable failed to erode it. That ice bore down on the drumlin, and it only consolidated the resistance. And in the end, the ice melted, but the drumlin stands. And so do we. Amen.